meeting between Colombia's National Strike Committee and President Ivan Duque this Monday, after 13 days of nationwide demonstrations and violent repression by state security forces, failed to result in any progress, with new mobilizations called for May 12th. This Monday, Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 20 people in Gaza, among them 9 children, and wounded 65 others, while the Palestinian resistance fired rockets on Israeli targets in Jerusalem. In the United States, the families of 165 victims of police brutality are calling on the United Nations to set up an independent inquiry into the ongoing police killings of black men and women. From the headquarters of teleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm Katrina Goss. Colombia's National Strike Committee met with President Ivan Duque for talks this Monday after 13 days of nationwide demonstrations and violent repression by state security forces. According to Strike Committee representatives, the meeting failed to result in any progress, as the government has refused to negotiate on the key demands presented, including that it withdraw its neoliberal package of bills, which sparked the widespread protests due to their damaging consequences for a population already suffering an economic crisis. Meanwhile, the repression of peaceful protesters by state security forces continues, with the president vowing to dispatch more police officers and soldiers to the city of Cali, which has become an epicenter of the unrest. Given the lack of progress in achieving its demands, the National Strike Committee called for renewed mobilizations on May 12th.
That has been inflicted in a disproportionate manner against peaceful protesters. We have demanded a stop to the massacre. We have demanded a stop to the violence against people who are exercising their legitimate right to protest. The meeting with President Ivan Duque shows that there was no empathy from the government with the reasons, with the demands that have led to this national strike.
And in Colombia, 47 people have been killed during the nationwide protests against the neoliberal economic reforms imposed by the government of Ivan Duque and the ongoing and escalating violence in the country. 39 of the deaths have been confirmed as due to police brutality. According to the Colombian NGO Temblores, which monitors police violence in the country, and the Institute for Peace and Development, state security forces have detained over 900 people since the protests broke out and committed acts of sexual abuse against 12 women. As of Monday, 278 violent police attacks have been reported and 28 people suffered eye injuries due to police deliberately shooting at demonstrators' faces. Between April 28th and May 7th, over 500 protesters were reported as missing. 35 of the 47 people killed so far were from the city of Cali, which has been the epicenter of the anti-government protests since April 28. And Colombian indigenous peoples who've joined the national strike movement as part of their own collective act of protest known as a minga have denounced acts of violence targeting their communities as part of the violent state repression of protesters. On Sunday night, Colombian President Ivan Duque instructed indigenous protesters in the city of Cali to return to their reservations in order to avoid violent confrontations with citizens in a thinly veiled threat. Likewise, a mayor in the east of Cali ordered the indigenous Minga to leave the territory. The Regional Indigenous Council of Cauca has rejected the use of state terrorism to delegitimize and criminalize the protests. The council stressed that police are falsely accusing indigenous peoples of acts of vandalism as part of the disinformation campaigns promoted by the Colombian government to justify the use of excessive force against demonstrators. In this sense, the Minga has demanded that the government provide guarantees for the legitimate exercise of social protests, the work of the defence of human rights and alternative media, while calling for a response from the national and local authorities to the acts of extremist groups against indigenous communities. And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back to From the South. Israel continues to conduct airstrikes on Gaza, with reports of at least 20 people killed, among them 9 children and another 65 wounded, while the Palestinian resistance fired rockets on Israeli targets in Jerusalem. The Palestinian resistance movement Hamas had earlier on Monday issued a 1-hour ultimatum for the Israeli regime to withdraw its forces from the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the occupied city. In retaliation, Israeli aircraft began bombing the Gaza Strip. According to local reports, among the targets were a mosque. Dozens of rockets were also reportedly fired from Gaza towards several illegal Israeli settlements on occupied Palestinian land. Over 500 Palestinians have been injured since Friday, when Israeli forces began attacking worshippers in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. And hundreds of Palestinians demonstrated on Sunday night in the West Bank city of Ramallah to protest the Israeli measures against Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem and the attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Demonstrations occurred near the military checkpoint close to the illegal Israeli settlement of Bet El, north of Ramallah, after the march headed towards the site. The Israeli security forces used tear gas to disperse the protesters. Israel vowed on Sunday to restore order in Jerusalem after hundreds of Palestinian protesters were wounded in violent repression by the regime. The area around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, has seen several nights of violence, the worst since 2017, fueled by a years-long bid by illegal Jewish settlers to take over nearby Palestinian homes in Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem.
We are all here to support Jerusalem. We are here to refuse all the Israelis' actions towards Palestinians, prayers, the people of Sheikh Jarrah. We are here to say that Jerusalem is not alone, and what is happening in Jerusalem is refused by all Palestinians.
On Monday, at least 13 people were killed and 37 others injured in two bomb blasts that occurred in two different provinces of Afghanistan, right after the Taliban announced a 3-day ceasefire, the Interior Ministry stated. The ceasefire marks this week's Eid al-Fitr holiday and came 2 days after more than 50 people were killed in bomb blasts outside a school in the capital, Kabul. The announcement comes as the United States has stated it will pull out its last 2,500 troops 20 years after it invaded the country and removed the Taliban from power, although the Biden administration has pledged a slower withdrawal period than that which was previously agreed by the Trump administration and the Taliban. Supposed US-led efforts to bring peace have faltered, and talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government have hardly progressed. An Afghan President Ashraf Ghani declared a day of national mourning for Tuesday after dozens of young girls were killed when a secondary school was targeted in the bloodiest attack in Afghanistan in over a year.
While we share our grief and mourning with the families to respect of the martyrs of the terrorist attack on innocent students in Logar province and the innocent female school students in Kabul, I am announcing a public mourning on Tuesday this week, and the ceremonies of offering prayers and condolences for the martyrs of these tragic incidents will be held in the Ark Mosque. All government departments in Kabul, provinces and countries' representations abroad, and other mosques.
On Monday, Iran officially confirmed holding negotiations with Saudi Arabia to mend ties and resolve the issues standing in the way of normal relations. The two countries cut bilateral ties in 2016 over scandals around the execution of a Shiite cleric in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh's claims of Iran's meddling in the domestic affairs of regional powers. The Saudi Foreign Ministry's head of policy planning reported that Iran and Saudi Arabia are engaged in negotiations to reduce tensions in the region. However, neither side has divulged details of the talks. But according to reports, in addition to bilateral ties, Tehran and Riyadh are talking about developments in Yemen and Iran's 2015 nuclear deal with world powers that Saudi Arabia has opposed. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reported that at least 25 people have been killed in the past 7 days due to heavy rains hitting several parts of Somalia. In a statement, the humanitarian agency said that among the dead were 14 children and 7 internally displaced people. The Somalia Water and Land Information Management warned of an imminent danger of potentially unprecedented flooding expected along the Shabelle River in the coming days and expressed concern for the safety and well-being of the people along the river. The heavy rains have hit various parts of the country, triggering flash floods, which have killed and displaced people and inundated farms. Forecasts suggest the rains will begin to subside from mid-May. On Sunday, the United Nations reported that over 1 million people face food insecurity and famine in Madagascar due to the worst drought in 40 years. The United Nations estimates that the south of the island will produce less than half of its usual harvest in the coming months because of poor rains, prolonging a hunger crisis already affecting half of the Grand Sud area's population. The south saw 50% of its usual rainfall during the October planting season in a 4th year of drought. According to the Famine Early Warning System Network, most poor families have to rely on foraging for wild foods and leaves that are difficult to eat and can be dangerous for children and pregnant women. Also, aid agencies have reported people eating termites and mixing clay with tamarind. The UN World Food Programme says acute malnutrition in children under 5 has almost doubled over the past 4 months in most districts in the south of the country. And we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. In the United States, the families of 165 victims of police brutality are calling on the United Nations to set up an independent inquiry into the ongoing police killings of black men and women. In a letter sent on Monday to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the families called for an independent inquiry into the killings and violent law enforcement responses to protests in the US. Among the families who've joined the call are relatives of victims of some of the most notorious police killings in recent memory. They include the families of George Floyd, Michael Brown, the 18-year-old killed in 2014 by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, which spurred the growing Black Lives Matter movement, and Downty Wright, who was shot in a routine traffic stop in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota last month. With the support of more than 250 civil society groups from around the world, including the American Civil Liberties Union, the families are hoping to engage the UN in efforts to rein in police violence against African American communities. On Monday, 5 people, including a woman and a child, drowned when a boat carrying at least 45 Europe-bound asylum seekers capsized off the coast of Libya, according to a UN migration official. The wreck took place on Sunday while fishermen rescued 40 of those on the vessel and returned them to shore, a spokesperson for the International Organization for Migration said. The boat was carrying 9 others, carrying more than 700 asylum seekers intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard. Meanwhile, more than 2,000 people arrived in the Italian island of Lampedusa in 20 boats in the last 24 hours, which has seen authorities ask for help from the Italian president to address the issue of migration flows. Around 7,000 Europe-bound asylum seekers were intercepted and returned to Libya so far this year, according to the International Organization of Migration's tally. This Monday, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the African National Congress has named Jesse Duarte as its temporary Secretary General, following last week's suspension of Elias Magashule, who's facing corruption charges.
In light of the temporary suspension of the Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General Jesse Duarte will, in accordance with the ANC's constitution, carry out the functions entrusted to the Secretary General.
The European Union's Internal Market Commissioner Thierry Breton announced that the EU Commission did not renew its order for AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccines. 2 weeks ago, the EU launched legal proceedings against AstraZeneca for failing to respect the terms of its contract with the bloc. The slow pace of deliveries has frustrated European nations, and they have held the company responsible for partly delaying their vaccine rollout.
We didn't renew the AstraZeneca order after June. We'll see. We'll see what happens. AstraZeneca is an adenovirus vaccine. It's a vaccine that's very interesting. It was discovered by researchers at Oxford. It is very good. It is especially interesting because logistically it's easier to use. The temperature it's stored at. There were orders. This is where we are at now. I am being very serious here. We started this order with Pfizer Biotech because we are working with them on the second generation vaccines. So want to put ourselves in a situation where we are ahead of others when it comes to variants.
Tunisia has started a week of coronavirus restrictions covering the Eid religious holiday as hospitals struggle to cope with soaring COVID-19 cases. Prime Minister Hichem Mechichi said that Tunisia was going through the worst health crisis in its history and that health facilities were at risk of collapse. The new restrictions include the closure of mosques, markets and non-essential shops, the banning of family or cultural gatherings, while people are forbidden from travelling between different regions. An overnight curfew begins at 7 p.m. instead of 10 p.m. and runs until 5 a.m. Tunisia has recorded over 300,000 COVID-19 cases and more than 11,000 deaths.
There is a high number of patients in intensive care. Therefore, there are no available beds. The number of patients on ventilators is constantly increasing, not to mention the number of those who are waiting in the emergency room for an access to intensive care.
Egypt expects to receive a shipment of raw materials on May 18th that would kickstart the manufacturing of millions of doses of the Chinese Sinovac vaccine. The country's health minister said they hope to become a regional centre for vaccine manufacturing and exporting in the African continent.
God willing, we will receive the first shipment of raw materials to manufacture the Sinovac vaccine on the 18th of this month. The agreement stipulates that 40 million doses will be produced in the first year, and the first 2 million doses will be produced by the end of June. As for cooperation with Russia on the Sputnik V vaccine, we met with the Russian ambassador in Cairo, and we are very open to manufacturing with Russia. And there are some private companies that have already started cooperating, and we encourage them.
And we've come to the end of this news brief, but remember you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Katrina Goss. Thank you for watching.